Welcome to the solution video for the MongoDB challenge. I have the new project dialog open for Visual Studio 2019. Now this project has requested that we do a WinForm WPF app. That's a pretty standard thing. It's simple because we're just doing a simple CRUD application and splitting up a whole web server. It's kind of a little overkill of setup when we're just talking about testing out a database and how it works. But since .NET Core 3.0 is not officially out yet, we're in preview 5, I think, at this point, and they just announced that it'll be near the end of the summer before it comes out in release mode. The WPF and WinForm applications are not yet .NET Core compatible. You can do it, there's just no UI designer for it. So the tooling for building the UI drag and drop designers isn't quite here yet, but the actual code behind is. So in theory it could if we want to do a cutting edge .NET Core 3 project. But I don't think we want to do that. So what I'm going to do is basically we're going to prepare for the future in this application. So we're going to build a WinForm application in .NET Framework, but then we'll add in a .NET Standard library. That way we can take advantage of building an application that works today in .NET Framework, but also works tomorrow in .NET Core. So with that, let's create I could choose, desktop here if I wanted, or Windows, and scroll through, but I could also just type WinForm, and that should give us Windows Form Application .NET Framework. Notice the .NET Core is there, but I've got the preview bits of .NET Core 3 installed. That's why that's there. So ignore the .NET Core for now. Go with .NET Framework for our WinForm application. And let's call this the MongoDB solution and MongoDB solution app. And we'll make sure that's .NET Framework 4.7.2, which I believe is the latest. I think 4.8 might be out about now, but 4.7.2 is fine. We'll hit create. And now we have our application. We can start with a few changes. First of all, change form 1 over to something else. Let's just call it dashboard is fine. And we get this dialog here that says, do you want to rename everything else as form 1? Why, yes, I do. The only thing that does not change is it does not change the form 1 up here in the upper left-hand corner. So we'll change that to MongoDB challenge solution app. And let's change the font size to be something much more readable. So let's go with an 18, which makes the form massive. But we can just shrink that back down. There we go. And save that. And now we have our form set up. Now let's add in our class library. So right click on the solution, say add new project, and you want the .NET Standard class library. Okay. And we hit next, and we're going to call this let's call it Mongo library. It's not really just about Mongo. I mean, it kind of is for this application, but for your application, if this was going to be a full project, you need something much larger in scope, but I think this works for our demo application. We'll hit create. Wait for that to get created. And the first thing we do is we delete class 1 because I don't like anything that says class 1. I want to have something that's much more appropriately named. Note that when I select this, it brings up the CSproj file, which says that it is a .NET Standard 2.0, so that's what it's targeting. If we right-click on the project and go to properties, we'll see the same thing. It's targeting 2.0. That's ideal for us because 2.0 is capable of talking to the .NET Framework, or actually the reverse. .NET Framework can talk to .NET Standard 2.0. And there's a tree view diagram that some people find confusing. that explains what the lowest version of the .NET Standard is. But essentially, if you're creating a new project, you want .NET Standard 2.0 or higher. That gives you the access to the most libraries compared to 1.6 or below. So that works, I think, for what we need. So now let's create a class. And let's call this our Mongo CRUD class. And we're going to actually pattern this a lot, very similar to what we did in the video on Monday where we talked about when I introduced MongoDB and how it works. This is kind of almost a redo of that library just because at this point I want you to get comfortable with doing this over and over again. That's practice is important. Just watching me do it does give you the sense that, yeah, I can do that. But until you actually do it, it becomes just head knowledge. It's not actually practical knowledge, and it goes away very quickly otherwise. All right, so we got our CRUD library. Let's right-click on dependencies, manage a NuGet package, and we'll search for MongoDB. And get the MongoDB driver, which note, it works on .NET Standard 1.6.1 or higher, which is great. That's fine for us. So we'll hit install and hit OK and accept. So in our video on Monday, this was in .NET Core and now it's in .NET Standard, and yet everything should work the same way. And that's one of the beauties about .NET Standard is it works the same way, and yet we can use it with .NET Framework. So let's create our private iMongo database, which isn't in our using statement yet. So Control dot to add that driver in our database, and we'll create our constructor, and we'll pass in the database name. And we'll say var client equals new Mongo client. And then db equals client dot get database of named database. So it's going to open up a connection to our database when we instantiate this class. And now we can start working with the operations of this class. Now we have this set up, we can come over to our references in our MongoDB solution project, and we can right-click on references and say add reference. Select the Mongo library and hit OK. And now the dashboard form can talk to the Mongo CRUD library. So let's set this form up real quick. And this is, quick and dirty. We're not going to do anything too super special or super label, and email label. And then email text, last name text, first name text, and people list. People drop down. It's a little more clear. And then, of course, we have our submit button. So now you've labeled everything correctly. Notice there's no ones in this list anywhere. These are all the names of items on this list. Now we can wire up what this submit button does. So we'll wire this up first because we have no people in our list. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and populate that list just so we have it. So we need to create a binding list here, but we don't have the type to give it. So let's go in our Mongo library and create a folder. We'll call it models. And then inside the models folder, we're going to add a class, and we'll call this class the person model. And the person model is public. And we're going to have a few properties in here. First of all, we're going to have a GUID, which is the ID. We're going to have a string, which is first name. A string, which is last name. And a string, which is email address. And we need to mark this GUID as being our BSON ID. Control dot to add the using statement. Control dot enter, actually. And there's our model now. So our model is person model. It has 4 properties, which don't forget the ID. You need to have that in order to bring it back in as that same type. So now let's go to our Mongo CRUD, and we need to add a lookup here, a listing of all the people in our database. So we can create a public list of type T, not going to specify person model. We want to have it generic so we can reuse it. A list of type T called load records of type T. And we want to pass in the table name. All right. And in here, we need to have a collection. db.get collection of type T from the table. And then we want to do a return. Collection.find. This is the weird one here. New BSON document. Not BSON document array, BSON document. To list. And it's going to yell at me over here because it doesn't have the using statement for that. But now that find is looking for basically everything. The new BSON document says, hey, there's no limitations to our query. Return everything. So that load records will now allow us to come back to our dashboard code and start loading in our list. So let's create a binding list here of type person model. Control dot to add the using statement. We'll call this people equals, and let's actually not instantiate it here just yet. We want to instantiate it on load of the dashboard so we can actually populate that list and put it inside of our binding list. Now I'm using binding list because binding list allows us to update without having to refresh the data set. The thing is, I'm not sure I'm going to get any benefits out of it. And the reason why is because I have to, when I'm going to get that callback where I say, okay, we've inserted a record, I'm going to want to load the whole list from the database again. And so I'm not sure I want to manually loop through that list and find the newly added person and add that to the binding list, I may just want to refresh the entire list. So I think what I'm going to do is actually make this a list, not a binding list. And yes, I'm going to have to manually refresh the dropdown every time something changes, but that's what I was going to do anyway. And since it's a list, it becomes easier to work with. Binding list adds a few quirks to it that make it hard to repopulate. Whereas now, it's pretty simple, it's straightforward. We're getting a list in the database, we're just going to assign it right to overwrite people, and we won't have to worry about it. Okay, so now let's create a new method. So private void load, let's say load person data. And in here, we're going to make a call to the Mongo CRUD. So that class is called Mongo CRUD. Control dot to add the using statement. And let's call it db equals new Mongo CRUD. It's going to ask for a database. So what database do we want to talk to? Well, I'm going to create a private constant, and let's name this db name. Oops, constant. Everyone, this is a constant. This never changes. This is an absolute for the entire length of the application. It means that you can't accidentally change the value. It's always going to be this value as long as the application is running. Now in source code, you can change that value, but then you recompile and you're all set with that new constant. So let's say person table equals, and let's call this the, let's call people. That's straightforward and simple enough. And we assign this to the people list. So now we're taking a list that we get back from our load records and putting it right into the people list. So now we can assign our lists, which I believe is people dropdown dot data source. Whenever we print out this person model, instead of just printing out the full path, it's going to print out this instead. And that's actually what we want. And that does save us a little bit of work over here. And anywhere else that we say just print this class, it's going to print first name and last name. So with that, that should be all we needed to load up our person list. So let's call that. And if we run this, it should at least not break. But let's find out. It broke. Could not find file or assembly, driver 2.8 or one of those dependencies. System cannot find the file specified. Interesting. The reason this is interesting is because it's saying it can't even load the package, the NuGet package. Start this again, and we get the same error here. Let's go to view details and find out why. No inner exception. Okay, let's go ahead and copy this message. Copy the value, and I'll paste it into Google. Let me go ahead and drag the results of that search here. I just put the whole thing in, including quotes, but it said, hey, I couldn't find it in quotes, but I can find it without quotes, which is fine because what's happening is the version number is different or the assembly is different. But if you look down here in the second version, yes, I did pre-peek at this to make sure it's the right one. This person's had the same problem in a very similar situation. So come down here, I create a library targeting .NET Standard 2.0. with the Mongo C# driver package, which is what we're doing. Another targeting 4.6.1, which ours is 4.7.2, but close enough. And they got this message here, which the basic solution for, and Scott Hanselman, wow, not Shane, Scott Hanselman did a blog post on, which is very, very helpful. We can look at that real quick here, where he had an issue with Entity Framework. But the basic solution is to put this line right here into our CS proj file for our .NET Framework project. And the reason why is because .NET Framework projects use the older style of packages.config for package management, whereas the newer projects use the package reference method of doing so. So we just need to tell a CS proj to use the package reference instead of the default package.config. Or you can change it right in Visual Studio to default to that. But we're going to look for the first property group and add this to it. So let's hit stop here. The nice thing now is with these, we can just double click, or we can actually edit this CS proj file. The unfortunate part is because it's a .NET Framework project, I can't just right click on it and say edit project file like I can do with this, that's super helpful. But if we go to do the same thing here, that option's not there. So instead, we've got a few options, but one of them is to unload project. And now that we're unloaded the project, we can edit the solution. In the first property group, we're going to add this configuration, which is restore project style, and that's the package reference. You can save that. We can close it down. We can right click and say reload project. And now we can do a rebuild. Restore is complete. And now we can run our solution. And we get a list, which of course is going to be empty because there's no people in it, but it has gone out and looked for that database. Okay, so a little bit roundabout, but I wanted to show you that to kind of show off that, hey, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes if you're working with these .NET Standard versus .NET Core versus .NET Framework, you can have some weird, quirky issues, but never fear, there is a solution for it. And it may feel like, man, I wish that wouldn't happen. And I get that. But at the end of the day, we're in a transitional period. And this is Microsoft's way of helping us transition easier than we've had in the past. In the past, sometimes transitions were basically, okay, stop using this, start using this. This way, we're able to still use .NET Framework for a long time yet. And at the same time, we can start working with .NET Core and move forward on the new platform and start moving things over as we have time. That's really helpful for businesses. Okay, a little bit of a sidetrack, but now we're back on track. So now we have our code here, which is loading up our dropdown. Now let's talk through what has to happen next, which is we need an event on this button. Let's double click it. And this event should insert a new record into the database. So let's start off simple and just write the code for inserting a new record. I know that we have the dropdown, and if something's selected there, we need to do an update. But for now, let's just start simple and create that insert. So let's do this. Let's create a variable here called person model. That is the current person. This will allow us to use it for the inserts and then also still make it easy for updates as well. So current person, and then down here we can do is say current person dot first name equals first name text dot text, and current person dot last name equals last name text dot text, and current person dot email address equals email text dot text. So we have those three values, and now we can do an insert, which we don't have the insert method over here. So let's create one. So we'll say that a public void insert record of type T, and it will be the table and then the record. And in here we can say var collection equals db.get collection of type T for the table, and then collection.insert one of type or value record. That's it. So that insert one is going to insert one document into our collection. So now over here we can say, well, first of all, we have to question, do we keep opening the database connection up and closing it down, or do we keep one open forever? I think we want to open it and close it. I don't think we want to keep one open for too long. So db.insert record, and the record is going to be the, it's going to be first table, so person table. We're going to add the current person. That's it. So now we are done our submit button, except for a few cleanup tasks. So for example, first name text.text equals empty string. Last name text.text equals empty string. And email text.text equals empty string. Current person equals new current person or person model. And we also want to kick off the load person data method to load that new list and populate it. The reason why I'm not just putting this record, this current person into the list, is because it doesn't have the ID. Also, I've put everything underneath the click button or the click event, but that's not the way I'll leave it probably long term. Maybe for this demo I will, but it depends on how we do the update. But for now, this is fine for demo purposes. Also, this is how I develop. So I'll put code in and get it to run and then figure out how to modify it to clean it up. So let's see this in action. So we'll run this and we'll move over here, and people list is empty, but I can say Tim Corey, Tim at IamTimCorey.com, hit submit. Now there's a person in the list, and I can say Joe Smith, Joe at Smithy.com, and now we have 2 people in the list. Now we haven't done any of the select event here, but now we've got the insert working for our CRUD application. Now let's work on the updates. So if I select something, then it gets populated down here, and we have the ability to modify or update that record. Now, if you notice, when we loaded the form and we added somebody to the list, the person first on the list in the dropdown gets selected automatically. So we can't just play around with the selection here. We could, but it's not pretty, because then if a person's already selected, you have to hit the dropdown and select them again. And that's not ideal. But what I want to have happen is if I click the dropdown, select somebody, it populates these values. So I'm going to have to do some tweaking here to get this the way I want. One of the things I want to see is nothing in this box if we haven't selected anybody. So the way I'll do that is I'll actually add a blank record. So what I have here is we have the load person data where we're saying that right here, the load records, where we populate this list. Before I add the people list to the data source, I am going to say people dot insert, and we want to insert it as at position 0 in the first item. We're going to say new person model, and I'm actually going to not put anything in that person model. It's going to be blank. So no first name, no last name. That should give me what I want, but let's make sure it does. Notice now the person or the people list has nothing selected, but then we have Tim, Corey, and Joe Smith. By default, there's nothing visible. It's a little bit of a hack. You could also put in angle brackets. You could say drop down. So you click the drop down, select events. We have the selected index changed. And that's fine. We'll double click here. And that creates the people drop down selected index change event. And we're going to grab the selected item and cast it to type person model. So person model, person, or let's say selected person, equals person model from the people drop down dot selected item. What that does, it takes the selected item and says, okay, convert it over or cast it to type person model. This will work as long as it is a person model. If it's not, it's going to give an error. But don't worry, the entire list is person model, therefore we don't have to worry about it being the wrong type. Now I can say if selected person dot ID, and let's actually cut this out for a minute. I'm going to say string dot is null or white space on selected person dot ID to string is not equal to true. Or we can say equals false, I guess. So as long as it has an ID, it's not null, and it's not an empty value. As long as that's true, then what I want you to do is I want you to populate the current person. So current person equals selected person. And then we'll also name. It's not quite as ideal, but notice that the last name is null. I set the first name to a value, but not the last name. So selected person dot last name is null or white space. Let's try that. And now nothing is selected here. If I go to Tim Corey, that's selected. If I go to new person, Tim Corey is still populated. I'm not a huge fan of that. So here's what we could do. We could actually have an else here and wipe out all this information. So selected person equals new person model. And we can wipe out these values as well. What that'll do is anytime you change those values, it's going to clean out everything if you select the new person. All right, so there's the add new person. If I select instead Tim Corey, there's Tim's values. If I select add new person, it wipes them out again. Okay, so that's a little more in line with what we're looking for. Now let's work on the modification if someone is selected. So let's do this. When we go to insert a record, or actually, yes, insert a record, we need to check to make sure first that it should be an insert and not an update. 1, and we're going to say first new BSON document, and we'll look for the underscore ID. We're going to compare that. And then from here, we're going to pass in our record, and then it'll either be an update or an insert. So new update options is upsert equals true, like so. So that's our typical upsert statement. However, if our GUID is empty, what's that going to do? Well, let's find out. So let's call this every time. So instead of doing insert record, we're going to do an upsert record. And that requires us to have our table and then our GUID, which is our current person.id. So what if we try to add 2 new people? Is it going to update the second person, or the first person the second time because it's all zeros, or is it need something different? So let's try it out. So we have a new person. Let's say Sue. And then we'll add another person. Like so. So now let's look at our list. Notice we have Tim Corey, Joe Smith, and Jane Austen, but no Sue Storm. And the reason why is because Jane Austen has a GUID of all zeros. So that's not quite what we wanted. The GUID was not, it treated it like a true GUID, even though it was an empty GUID. And GUIDs aren't null by default. Therefore, you can make a nullable GUID, but that's a whole nother mess. We're not going to do that. Instead, we can't just call the upsert. We have to call the insert unless the GUID actually has a value. So let's do this. Let's call an insert. So, whoops, let's do this. Let's cut this out. To see if there's already a record there. There should be, and if so, we'll update it. But in the off chance there's not, we'll go ahead and do an insert. Now, since we did that insert with the bad record, I want to clean that out just to make sure we have good data. So let's go to Compass real quick and select our challenge DB and go to people. And here's that Jane Austen record that has all A's for the binary. Let's just delete that record. That way it's gone. We don't have to worry about it. And now we should be able to use this in its current form to do both inserts and updates. So it's 2 records. So let's add Sue Storm back. standard library and that kind of bug. But just in general, this was a little bit more work than it would appear on the surface. And that's okay, that happens. But just know that you shouldn't always think in the back of your mind, oh, that's easy, I don't have to do it. Give it a shot, try it, make sure you know how to do it. If it is easy, great. You don't have to worry about, continuing to do it. But if you run these kind of bugs, that's great as well. It teaches you debugging. It teaches you how to overcome these challenges and how to better use what you thought was easy. So now, if we select a new person, we type it in, but I type in Timothy Corey. We want to make sure that we do a match first to see, is there already a Timothy Corey in the system? And if so, do an update instead of an insert. Okay, so what we're going to do is in our Mongo CRUD application, let's add a new method. And this is the quick way of doing it. We could do a more genericized version of this, but this I think will do for this. And that's going to be load, or let's go with find record by names. And we're going to pass in the table and then the string first name and string last name. And then in here, we need to, it doesn't return a value. That's fine. We need to start with our collection. And then from here, we're going to create a filter. So you say builders of type T, filter, dot, and then equals. And we're going to compare the first name to the first name. The problem is that now how do we add another filter? We need to add another one for last name. We don't have that ability because this is a single filter. So how in .NET do we do multiples of something? Well, it's a list. Let's create a list of filter definition of type T. And we'll call this filters equals new list, but I'm going to do the curly braces here. And let's add this. And now I need to put like semicolon at the end. I'm going to do a comma and add another one, but this time I'm going to say last name and last name. So that takes care of having more than one filter. But then how do we use this? Well, we're going to return collection.find, and we'll pass in the problem here is if we try and pass in the filters, that just doesn't work because we haven't defined it in a way that the find can use it. So instead, what we need to do is come up here first, and we need to create, and let's just do a var here, and let's just say the filter concatenation equals builders of type T dot or, dot filter dot or, actually and, not or, and then pass in our list of filters. What this does is it says, okay, we have some filters here, but I want you to do an and on them, meaning this has to be equal and this has to be equal. So first name has to equal this value and last name has to equal this value. Or would be if one of these matches. So doing that, then we can pass that into the find and return that. The thing is, right now it's an iFluent, so we do toList, and our issue up here. We have to return a list of T, which is what you want, because we want a more than one if there is more than one, because that would tell us, hey, you've got a problem. So if you have more than one, then were we updating? Well, we're probably updating all of them, I would assume. They're all the same record, I guess. This isn't the greatest application because you can have more than one Joe Smith, but let's assume that this is what we want to do. So now let's go over to our code behind, and instead of doing the insert here, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little more code here, which is going to make this method really big. And that's okay for now because I really want to wait until we're done and then we can refactor some of these things. So let's do this. Let's comment this out so we know it's not being used yet. And we're going to do a search. So let's say var found people equals db dot find record by names. And we're going to say current person dot first name and current person dot last name. And that's going to give us our, we also need a table name. So person table, and that should give us then our list. Let's find out why. Because right now it's yelling at us and it says that our table name and then our first name and last name should all be strings, which they are. So why is it saying I can't infer that? The type argument from method cannot be inferred from the usage. Find record by names. Okay. So we're not passing in the type for T. And since we're not passing in that type anywhere in here, we have to say this is person model. And now that works. So found people, which if found people dot count is greater than 0, then what I want you to do is loop through and do updates. Okay, so how do we do an update for these values? Well, we're going to need to grab the ID from the found person and then use our current person. So let's do a db.upsert, and we're going to pass in the person table, and the ID is going to be the found. We're going to have to do a loop through. So let's cut this out first. I'm trying to type and talk and think at the same time. For each. And the reason I did an if first is because the for each would have worked even with 0. It would have said, I'll just skip over that. But I didn't know then if I should do an insert or not. So var found person in found people. And then I can say found person dot ID. And the record is the current person. But before we do that, we have to update the current person.id equals the found person.id. So it's going to change the ID multiple times to that person if there's more than one record found. Now, if we don't find anybody, then I grab this right here and do an insert. All right. So now that's a little more complex way of going about it, but now we've got a case where if we look the person up by their name and we find a match, we just want to do an update to that. So if I were to say, let's say we have Timothy Corey. So if I say Timothy, notice I didn't select it, Corey, and let's change the email address to Tim, well, let's just do me at I am Tim Corey. So it's me instead of Tim at I am Tim Corey. We hit submit. Now if we select Timothy Corey, it says me at iamtimcorey.com, even though it used to say Tim at iamtimcorey.com. We can still do the update here. We can also still do the Mary White, Mary at sheep.com, and that still works as well. So we have all these different options now of updating versus inserting versus still updating even though you didn't select something, but you had that match. Now, is it ideal to match on first name and last name and do an update? No, not really. But the purpose behind that was to get you to look for two different things, which makes you go a little deeper into MongoDB than you otherwise would have with one. So just know that's the reason we did it. All right, last change we need to do to complete the bonus challenge, and that is that we need to copy one of these and add phone number. So we have our phone number here, phone number label, and phone number text. And we need to modify this to say phone. And now in our person model, we want to add that property. And it should be a string phone number. So now you've added this, and when we go to insert, let's actually check when we hit the submit button. So if in different places. So current person dot phone number equals phone number text dot text. And then down here, phone number text dot text equals empty. And then down here, we have phone number text dot text equals current person dot phone number. And then down here, phone number text dot text equals empty. Now you see here how by just doing it, instead of trying to optimize the beginning, it becomes obvious where you have repetition. So you have some there, and you have some there, and you have this stuff here, and you have this stuff here, where maybe we create something that synchronizes the two values or puts the values from one into the other in a way that is one method and it also has a clear value, clear all records. And then all of a sudden you have one method call in all these different spots, but you wouldn't have known what you needed up front necessarily. So that's why we optimize later, not right at the beginning, because it gives us a better picture of what we need to do to optimize. All right, in theory, if we run this and we say, let's add a new person, let's add Bob, let's just do Bob Smith. We go to submit and it says, nope, you need to enter a phone number. Okay. 555-1212. Let's put a dash in there. Submit. And now Bob Smith has a phone number, whereas Timothy Corey does not. But if I hit submit, it says, nope, you need to enter a phone number. So I can say 555-1234 and hit submit, and that works. So now Timothy Corey has a phone number, Bob Smith has a phone number, but Jane Austen does not. Okay, so that was our hopefully you learned something along the way and are now able to practice it on your own. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.